Okay. This is not an official meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission. We do not have a quorum. We are going to be doing a work session with remaining Planning Commission members who are here. It's July 8th, 2021, calling the non-meeting to order at 6:04 p.m. We have Commissioners John Knight, Luke Wojciechowski, and myself, Kaya Marienfeld, here. 3 Planning Commission members are absent, and 1 seat will not be filled until our next Planning Commission meeting. All right. Corey, what's our work session? So that means, I guess, we will be deferring the public hearing and possible action amending the code to add regulation for brew pubs, breweries, and distilleries until our next meeting, which will be July 22nd.
Oh, yes, right.
Yes.
I was thinking August already.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, the one remaining item, well, I guess unless you want to move us on to that.
Sure. Yeah, we were going to do a work session on amendments to section 1770, accessory dwelling units or ADUs.
All righty. I will go ahead and share screen. This will be quite a bit of talking to begin with, but as this is a discussion, there isn't any real structure to this, but really an explanation of what has happened on the state legislature level and how that's affecting our municipal code and our reactions to that, adjusting our municipal code, and also what other potential adjustments we might want to make at the same time, all regarding ADUs, accessory dwelling units. This information that's on the slideshow is taken right from the agenda summary, so if I'm moving too quickly, it's in the packets. You should be able to recover those, and anybody watching at home would be able to pull those offline. But again, this work session working on the amendments to our section 1770 ADUs. The reason for the city initiating changes to the ADU section of the MMC are twofold. The Utah State Legislature recently passed HB 82 single family housing modifications. This legislative action, addresses zoning and building provisions relating to internal ADUs. The difference there being, in our code, we reference ADUs, those being internal and detached as one description. Internal, obviously by the nature of it, is completely enclosed or attached to a primary structure, so the detached really becomes the differentiating factor.
So that might be like a basement mother-in-law apartment
Correct.
Style thing.
So something like a mother-in-law over a garage would still be a detached, even though it's part of an accessory structure. But if it's a part of the primary structure, basement, internal, or studio above.
Cool.
We did have a copy of the HB 82 here in person, and it's part of the packet, which goes through the whole bill. Only a portion of that is really related to what we're talking about. And the other reason is that it is time we review our current code language and recommend changes to further remove regulatory barriers. That being, we've had our ADU section in place for a while now, and working through some of those parameters and regulations that we have, we found that there seem to be continual, naturally occurring restrictions which limit folks that have existing structures from converting to ADUs or property structures the way they are in Moab, as far as the size primary structures that they have, limiting how they can function on that property. So addressing some of those issues we've begun to see. This description of the HB 82 is really just that with the House bill, we are responsible for amending our municipal code in reaction to that, consistent with what the legislature has had. I think there was a section of the League of Utah Cities and Towns submitted recommendations along with that of what else to include or how to react to some of those, what that means. That was included in your packet as well. And like it said on that previous slide, it doesn't address exterior ADUs, so that's something that we would be doing entirely on our own if we are adjusting those. This is the summary breakdown of that bill. It modifies and defines terms applicable to municipal and county land use, development, and management, allows the municipality or county to punish an individual who lists or offers a certain license or permitted accessory dwelling into a short-term rental, which lines up with what our current regulations are. Allows municipalities and counties to require specified physical changes to certain accessory dwelling units. In any single-family residential land use zone, requires municipalities and counties to classify certain accessory dwellings units as permitted land use. So it requires that that within municipalities, we acknowledge this land use at least in a certain percentage of our available residential land. And that was broken down in that bill. I think it identified 67% of your residential zones, and then I think there was another breakdown of 21% in there. It also prohibits municipalities and counties from establishing restrictions or requirements for certain accessory dwelling units with limited exceptions. We'll get into those a little bit more specifically. Allows a municipality or county to hold a lien against a real property or real property containing certain accessory dwelling units in certain circumstances. Provides for statewide amendments to the International Residential Code related to accessory dwelling units. Requires the executive director of the Olene Walker Housing Loan Fund to establish a 2-year pilot program to provide loan guarantees for certain loans related to accessory dwelling units. Prevents a homeowners association from prohibiting the construction or rental of certain accessory dwelling units and make technical and conforming changes. That was about the quickest you can summarize that whole bill. It was included in the packet, but it makes the additional summary to this is it makes ADUs much easier, internal ADUs much easier for property owners to develop or build. It deregulated a lot of the conditions that within our building department are required, typically in the form of separation of utilities, certain sizing requirements. Again, we'll go into more of those, but it made it a lot easier, but that also adds complications to the way we process those and then what the resulting complications from some of those decisions could be. This is the revisions updates to further remove regulatory barriers. In 2018, the MMC was amended to better regulate ADUs. This effort was one piece of an ongoing effort to encourage employee housing and to remove regulatory barriers to building employee housing. The current regulations allow ADUs as permitted use, requiring only a building permit in the R2, R3, R4, and RA1 zones. There are standards and criteria that apply to ADUs. The code section is attached as Exhibit B within the packet. It has been a few years since these provisions have been adopted, and it is appropriate to reevaluate them based on the experience over the last 3 years. The most significant barriers related to external ADUs include adhering to underlying zone required setbacks, adhering to the 20-foot maximum building height for ADUs over existing garages. And so those were two of the most outstanding. That when we're seeing folks come in trying to convert to an ADU, they run into that, and it could, in essence, prevent them from being able to move forward with an ADU, which is a response to Moab's need and desire for, by design, affordable housing, and rental. These are some of the discussion topics, so this is where we may start slowing down and opening up to what we're talking about. Is in the general standards, the front yard setback for an ADU should be at least equal to the plane of the front wall of the principal structure. The question here is, should we consider eliminating this and allowing ADUs in the front yard as long as they meet the code required setback? To explain that a little bit further, if you had a primary structure that's 25 feet back on the setback, the way the current code structures lines is that it can be at least as far back as the front plane of that wall of the primary. So also 25 feet back. However, within that same code requirement, I think with even potentially in the same paragraph sentence, it identifies or meets the underlying code setback. So there's some discrepancy that's written into the code there. That would be something that would be wise to clear up. Whether you want to eliminate or add this section, it's kind of up to you guys. Does that concept make sense?
Yeah, it does. So As it's currently written, there's inconsistency, you're saying, because it says or.
Right, so
If
we're-
it
what
meets the
this would be,
25-foot setback, it
if,
could be.
so if it's a 15-foot setback,
sorry,
but the
yeah.
building is 25 feet, it couldn't be, or it could be debated that it could be up 15 feet. What we would do here is clean it up to say it can definitely be in front of the primary
Yeah.
because it does meet the underlying setbacks.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like a no-brainer, but of course, everything has some unintended consequences, so.
I think that's fine. There's a lot of really large front yards, places who set their primary structure back, and if
Right.
it's gonna prohibit them from
Right.
an internal or external ADU, then screw it.
What we found is when that does happen, people have tried to reorient where they'll all of a sudden create the new ADU as the new primary and then convert the old,
Yeah.
which is just a workaround. We'd
If
rather
you
have
the
it be,
room, sure, but.
right,
What are some of the unintended consequences? Like, trying to think of it.
sure. It's related to accessory dwelling, or excuse me, accessory structures have a different code description where they are not allowed to be within the front yard, so they're not allowed to be past the front structure unless it's a carport or some variant of that. Then it goes into a whole breakdown of different scenarios where it may be approved to do that. But allowing a structure in front of a primary may change the nature of whatever the neighborhood is, whether there's a consistency of structures that are all 25 feet. For whatever reason, maybe that was the previous zone setback, and now we're allowing a structure 15 feet in front. It's nothing that is going to be legally consequential. It's just a matter of changing nature. You may get feedback from the community saying, why did you permit that? And we'd have to be able to have a finding of fact saying, well, it meets the code.
You could talk to me.
Okay.
I'll tell them I don't care.
Okay. I guess the short answer is there aren't many, but there
Yeah,
always
no,
are
it's
some.
good. It's good to understand what the potential, I know we run into that a lot.
I think it makes
We're like,
sense. Like,
Yeah,
one question that I had though, and sorry, this goes back a little bit, but the code, HB 82 states that it prevents homeowner associations from prohibiting the construction. So if it's
Yeah.
outlined in the covenants of that community that they can't build it, does this code supersede that?
yeah,
It
where the
would
city
be
code
as
didn't.
state code, right? Municipal code is a little different,
Yep,
given that's state
So
law.
the
It
state
didn't
law will
change.
supersede the covenants that have been there for
Correct.
30 years or whatever.
In theory, the rights of an HOA or CCNRs are designated by the state, so the state changing those, it just bypasses us, which is good, because that's where maybe those, communication should be coming from,
I mean, my HOA, I think, in our CCNRs, it prohibits ADUs, so.
right?
Not
Not
anymore.
anymore.
Right.
How will that affect them? Because I know like our CCR has very specific guidelines for what type of, like, I think we're able to select from one of 4 different models of like home to build. And potentially, I don't think anything in my neighborhood is far enough back to potentially move an ADU to the front of the property, but like,
Well-
would it be incumbent on the HOAs to amend their CCRs in response to this to?
Yes, it will be their responsibility to handle their own jurisdiction as far as the regulations they have in place. The important note here, and this is where it can get a little confusing as we start talking in these interchange of external and internal. Internal is the only thing that's being addressed by this bill, but at the same time where we are obligated as a municipality to respond to this House bill, we're also saying, well, there's these other components of our external ADUs that are an issue. So we don't, as a planning commission, don't really have much to say about the internal ADUs.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of information on there that is complicated for our building department and how we're going to move forward with that. But it does reflect some things like there is not a maximum, and we'll get to that shortly. There's not a maximum square footage for an internal ADU anymore, which we previously had. This House bill removed that. But would we want to continue that requirement in external ADUs because it's not a requirement for the internal? So to create consistency between ADUs or this.
Yeah,
But there might be a disadvantage because then all of a sudden you
Yeah.
could have 2,500 square foot ADUs as opposed to 1,000 square foot maximum, which was what we have now. So we're working there. So I think on that first comment, we're feeling pretty comfortable that's the way to go. The second one we continually see is an accessory dwelling may be constructed above a garage and consistent with the same floor area provided, that it shall not protrude beyond the ground floor wall and shall not consist of more than one story above the ground floor. The overall structure shall not exceed 20 feet in height. Should the allowable height be more than 20 feet, it is difficult to have a garage and an ADU above and meet this building height of 20 feet and conform with the pitch roof standard. So, with that saying, to set a scenario here, there could be potentially a garage that's quite wide and quite deep, a large floor area, and it could even be over 1,000 square feet in theory. As you build that ADU up on top, we have ability within the code that you can maintain, say, 150 square feet, which is above 1,000 square foot max, as long as it meets, you're just building straight up from whatever the garage was. However, the pitched roof requirement would mean that over that larger expanse, the pitch of that would naturally increase beyond 20 feet. So that's a natural inhibitor from allowing a large above garage ADU. What we found is the 20 feet for a reasonable garage, a standard reasonable garage, say, call it 22 by 25, the kind of a mix in the middle there, makes it difficult with that pitch, even something that size.
And it's currently 30 feet in R2 is the height restriction?
For residential, right. So ADU, that 20, which is the height restriction for ADUs, external ADUs, period. So whether it's its own detached and it's a 2-floor ADU, or it's one of these garage units.
What is, in your experience, what do you think would be the minimum you could go higher while still sort of capturing the
Sure.
intent, but actually allowing more ADUs to be built
Right.
in those kind of scenarios? Do you need to go up to 30 or could 25 suffice?
And that's a great question. Having 30 as the underlying zone height requirement, it seems like it might make sense to have it consistent that way, allowing for, of course, a garage, which in order with many of the vehicles we have down here that are 4-wheel drive to be able to access and utilize your garage, it's going to have to be at the very least, an 8-foot garage with a 9-foot potential ceiling. You can get a lot comfier than that. You can go to 10. You can get really, hobby shop and go 12. But as you're pushing that up, of course, you're shrinking your ability to have the joists and then floor area. So the actual construction of that space. So 25, I think, would be achievable, but 30 may be more consistent.
Yeah.
And again, building height in Moab is measured from the midpoint of the slope of the roof, which is complicated, but it's meant to, I think, offset that concept that we have a hard top of your ceiling, and that's giving you a little luxury of where that peak is. So if you have a peaked roof, we're not saying it's the tall peak which squishes everything down.
Yeah.
So the midpoint of the slope of the roof is meant to accommodate for the pitched roof standard to a certain degree. So 25 isn't, if that weren't the case and the peak were 25, I'd say we're still not in good shape, but 25 with that standard might be appropriate. 30 would be more.
Seems to me it make consistent with the underlying zone.
Yeah.
30 feet's why have two different?
I see that as the
standards?
main pushback you get from, I'm just thinking hypothetically.
Right.
So if you have, existing neighborhood in an R2 or R3, what have you, where yes, you can build 30, but most people don't have 30. Most people have 20 or under on existing structures. I mean, it's the same stuff we saw with the pad. People threw a fit because we were allowing 30 feet.
Mhm.
Didn't realize that was what was already allowed in the
Right.
underlying zone.
Right.
So if you're worried about character, I think that could be the thing that could potentially get quite a bit of pushback.
Sure.
Would be, oh, well, all of our houses are this height, but my neighbor's building an ADU in their backyard and it's 3 stories.
Right.
So.
Well, and the additional pondering to this is, and we've seen this as well, is we've had a great number of complaints from neighbors of ADU builders who are building an external ADU that is the full 20 feet, but the way they've constructed those, they're feeling like it's right on the property line. So at the building heights that we've had already, we've had every ADU that's gone up, we've had complaints from the neighbors about it peering over into their backyard, loss of privacy.
Yeah.
So that's just gonna be a natural conflict of development anyway. And in
Yeah.
a situation, in my mind, where you wanna try to make the urban core more dense, I mean, that's gonna protect the surrounding environment. That's just gonna be a natural conflict that happens all the time. And it's a bummer, but that's, I mean, for our family, we always talk, well, gosh, do we move out in the valley? Do we want more space, or do we stay in the city? And we choose to stay in the city full knowing that that's a potential consequence.
This, and I believe there's another question coming up, and maybe we'll go to this next question and then finish up with this one. Maybe it's not on here.
No, it's definitely nothing more than folks trying to, protect the existing sort
Right.
of feel, realizing that, yeah, their neighbor could build a 3-story house because the house is already there. They're not gonna, but this is a way that that's more likely to happen. You
Probably
can
do
see
the same
people.
thing if my neighbor did that, but then I would say, okay, well.
Yeah.
That's
No,
what-
totally, and that's just what we have to, what we need to do a better job explaining, I think, is that this is a city, and it's ultimately a city.
Sure.
If you're in the city, you're in the city, and infill is important, and I think we've done a poor job of articulating that to the public, or
Sure.
convincing, I should say,
Right.
in the past. It's been a big sticking point.
One of the concepts that plays into this, I think, pretty closely is setback. So that was one of, that we've
Yeah.
skipped to the end here, but
Totally.
setbacks. The code requires setbacks consistent with the underlying zone for primary structures. So your typical zone is 15 front, 7-foot side, and 12-foot rear. Should we consider reducing the side and rear setbacks for external ADUs?
I think potentially if we're not going to elevate the height. I think if we're elevating the height, that might be a good trade-off to say, hey, the setback is still the same, because that does make a difference if you have a 30-foot structure 10 feet from you or 15 feet from you. It makes a huge difference in feel. Perhaps that's a way to
So let me ask this
sort of
then.
massage that. I'm certainly of the mind of like, the more ways we can make more housing feasible, the better. But I'm 100% foreseeing that being an issue
Yep.
when it gets to council.
My only thought would be, would it make more sense to keep it at 20 feet and reduce the setback?
It might. It very well might.
I don't think we would really know unless we did like an
Yeah.
analysis of all the properties in the zone.
Yeah.
Right.
I was-
See how much land is available.
Which one would make it more feasible for more of these things to be able to pop up? It might be the setbacks.
Yep. I think more consistently, that's been the problem people are facing.
All right.
I think there are
Yeah.
a few garage conversions that we've seen that are like, it'd be nice to have higher ceilings, and that's kind of where they're coming from. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, we understand, it'd be nice. But there's many that they're measuring, they're trying to maintain that open space area of the backyard, have the appropriate circulation that they need in the backyard, but just can't make it work within that 12-foot. The 7, that's pretty reasonable for a side.
Yeah.
But the rear can kind of hurt some folks. One thing to consider in this, and I don't think it's a secret, is
And
kind
the
of
rear is 12 now?
what was that?
The rear is 12?
The rear is 12
Yeah.
for nearly all of the zones.
Okay.
It was 10, maybe at the previous iteration, because we do have some structures that were built there historically, but
Okay.
I'm guessing around 2012 is about when that conversion
Okay.
happened to 12-foot rear. Is mostly consistent in the residential zones. They increase in the R1, but for what we're talking about, R2, R3, R4.
Cool.
So,
Yeah, it's all about kind of, I guess, what you think would smooth the
Right.
way for more.
and this is bringing this up because it's, we're representatives of the public for the public doing public work. We're just simply interpreting what the code says, and then we're letting legislative bodies make that. But the way the current code is, going back to ADUs above a garage, a garage is an accessory structure. Our accessory structure setbacks are for any structure under 10 feet, is 3 feet to the property lines. Any structure over 10 feet is 5 feet to the property lines. That's mostly for fire separation reasons, is if you had a 5 foot on your side and a 5 foot on your neighbor's side between their accessory shed, garage, whatever, that's 10 feet. 10 feet is the minimum fire separation without increased fire suppression. That being said, if you develop, and we've seen this as well, develop a garage, if there is a garage and it's there, you can build within 5 feet of the property line now on both the rear and the side, regardless of underlying setbacks for the accessory structure, or accessory dwelling, excuse me. So what I'm getting at here is when we were chatting with Barry Ellison, our building official, we asked, what would you be comfortable with as far as your setback requirements? He said 7. We said 5 because accessory structures are 5. He said, I'd feel much more comfortable with 7. It seems to make more sense. With eaves and the way that works as far as pitched roofs go. The problem with this is it creates a loophole as we're strategizing between height. So I think kind of where John was coming from is, well, we reduce setback and maintain the height, right? That's where you're at?
Oh yeah, I was just throwing the inverse of what
Right.
I was throwing at there.
It would make this loophole, it would close this loophole essentially by making it less of a loophole and more of a standard of building, that you could build your accessory structures at the same place you can build an ADU that's on top of that accessory structure.
Got it. And the current accessory structure setback is?
Depending on the height, accessory structure is 3 feet or 5 feet, which is a far cry from 12 feet. Did you say accessory structure?
Yeah.
Yeah, accessory, like a shed or a garage,
Yeah.
is 3 feet or 5 feet based on the height.
Yep.
An accessory garage could be 5 feet, and then all of a sudden now you've got your ADU that's potentially larger than 1,000 square feet,
Yep.
5 feet from the property line, and right now it's kept to 20, but depending if you increase the height but didn't change anything else, you could potentially have, in this scenario, a 30-foot tall ADU on top of a garage 5 feet from the property line. That's what that scenario would entail if you
Got it.
didn't change
A
anything.
handful of properties where that loophole would exist.
Yeah.
Well, I might bury myself right now by saying this, but that's an accessory structure that already exists, right? Unfortunately, there isn't any code provision, which is why I want to discuss it, so that if we do want to put a parameter in here, we can, is that somebody could come in for a new development, a house and a garage, accessory garage, detached, and have that permitted, built, and get the CO, and that next day come in for an ADU above the garage permit. So while they wouldn't be able to do it as a part of the original permit, they would be able to do that conversion.
So it
Immediately
seems
following.
prudent, with all of that in mind, that the height restriction for ADUs almost serves to sort of push back a little bit against that being super duper feasible to the point that it's going to happen more often.
Right.
So to me, just gut reaction to all of that is that 20 feet for an ADU, regardless of where it's built, makes sense because it makes it so everyone who has a garage that's 5 feet from their property line can't necessarily just pop an ADU on the top of it.
Or that we make that a specific concept. Now that we're realizing
Yeah.
that is a strategy, it's not become, and that's what all this ADU stuff and internal stuff originated as, is
Yeah.
a mother-in-law apartment, something that meant to help your immediate family member.
Yeah.
Well, do they have to be your immediate family member?
Yeah.
Okay, no. Okay, can you rent it out long-term? Okay, yes. And then became now a new tool in our toolbox that has this now strategy of, well, I'm going to build a garage and then I'm going to put an ADU on it,
Yeah.
and that way I don't have to meet the setback
Could we
requirements.
write into code? I mean, that seems like that
So you
would
could
be
separate
changed.
and
I was
say,
just gonna say,
for an
yeah.
external ADU that's not above a garage,
Yeah.
it could be 30 feet or 25, whatever.
Yeah.
And for an external ADU that is above a garage, it has to maintain the 20-foot or 25, reduce it from whatever the other exterior is, because we anticipate it would likely be closer to the property line.
Or you could
Not-
also say, if an ADU is constructed on an existing
Accessory.
accessory unit, the
accessory
setback
structure.
requirements, whichever is greater, supersede. So you could have it so ADUs still have to meet ADU setbacks regardless of where they're constructed. That could be written in too, right?
You could, so that's even pulling it back even further
Yeah.
by saying your accessory structure is 5 feet from the property line, but you have to put another 7 feet onto it. So it'd be,
Yeah.
in theory, a flat terrace before your ADU starts.
Close that loophole.
It would. I think it may not be the most opportune way to do it that makes it, that'd be pretty unattractive for developers or homeowners
Yeah.
to do that. That would be a way to close it. But I think now within this discussion, we have a new opportunity where, as we're talking about moving them, because
Yeah.
Nora has, in
Could we
this
have like a
prep,
grandfather provision where, not a provision, but
Any accessory
Any-
unit built before this
yeah,
time.
or existing, of any accessory structure existing prior to whenever this goes into effect. Just trying to figure out a way to close the loophole of someone building a new accessory structure that's much closer to their property line than you
Right.
could get if it was just an ADU and then putting.
Kind
an
of
ADU
depends
on it.
what we want the setback to be for
Yeah.
ADUs.
I
May
think
not
ADUs
matter.
at 7 makes sense to me.
okay,
Does
I'm thinking of it being a lot smaller, and if it were me right now, it would be the 7-foot setback for an ADU with the existing 20-foot height.
Does the city have the data readily available to do an analysis of like how many more opportunities there would be?
it would
If you
be,
change the setback?
So it's certainly
It would be-
messaging.
it would be quite extensive. We don't have the data, I guess the short answer. We wouldn't have the data to do that.
It's not like a GIS person for a couple hours of work.
Yeah, it'd be, we've done that for restaurants, so how many restaurants we have, pretty simple to ask,
Yeah.
and it's a pretty extensive process.
That's fine. Then it's more just.
There's a lot of speculation between sheds and garages.
My
Totally.
gut feeling is it would do more good to have the setback reduced than the height higher based upon what you've said.
What's difficult is when Nora's crafting some of these discussion points, is that it's both. It really is both. And I think there's compromise between the two. I just think this is one of those scenarios, because if you had a perfect scenario for
Yeah.
height, great. Perfect scenario for setbacks, great. But when you combine them, as well as this kind of odd accessory garage scenario, it's one that we've seen and one we'll continue to see as kind of the ugly stepchild of the ADU code where it gets really messy.
Yeah.
So
I
think a combination of both, where you were maybe mentioning, okay, if it's an accessory structure above a garage, it can be within that accessory structure setback, but it can only be to 25 feet.
Yeah.
So that addresses the height, which is what the main struggle is for garage extended ADUs. But then it also, we can allow a different code section to address height of exterior ADUs that are being built now, or there isn't a grandfathered element to it,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Would that actually do something? I'd almost rather,
So you
if
could
it
have a-
was like you have this pool over here of things that could use a little more height, and this pool over here of
Yeah.
things that could use less setback.
That's kind of,
I want to make sure we're not doing what often happens out of city council, where we're doing a little bit, and then you get nothing.
right,
I'd rather take all of one of those buckets if
I
we
see.
can,
I see.
if that's going to make things more feasible.
And I think trying to wrap it into one code,
Yeah,
you'd be
for
double
sure,
dipping and not
one code,
not
but
doing
like
it.
if there's a compromise, I'd rather like
If you did-
actually just do one of those things rather than a little bit of both that
Okay,
won't
I
actually
see.
get anybody to build
Couldn't we
one.
just
I feel like if you did two codes, one for, that would be the division, is
Yeah.
what I've seen as a planner is accessory, we have a new code for internal ADUs, we have exterior ADUs, but we make a new provision for exterior ADUs that are above an accessory structure. So that is a new definition
Yeah,
that handles, you can either keep it at 20, and then it doesn't necessarily address the issues we've seen, but it would address the adjacent properties, building concerns. But for an accessory structure, accessory dwelling, gosh, it is There's a lot
I
of
know.
accessories going on. Accessory dwelling that's exterior but not near the property line, 30 feet or, 25, whatever you just determine, would be a really helpful thing for folks to have. It makes it consistent with the rest of the residential zone. But it's just when you're starting to add it to the garage is when it gets tricky, because there is that additional push towards the property line. However, like John was saying, maybe you don't address height at all and you just allow it to be closer. I think predominantly that would handle more of the issues than the height would. I think the setbacks are stopping a lot more ADUs from being built than the height.
So my view is, and I'm one for more simplicity, so sometimes that can bite me, but my view is you just change the setback, wait a year and see if
Yep, that's mine
applications
too.
increase. If they don't, then we make it another adjustment.
That's what I think too.
So
It sounds like setbacks are the bigger impediment right now to these actually being
Okay.
feasible for more property owners, so
It's an easy change.
it's
Moving
an easy change.
the setbacks to 7.
Yeah. It's clean.
7 side, 7 rear. Makes sense. It's already a 7 side, so that's not so hard, but it's 12 rear that really does catch people.
Yeah.
7 side, 7 rear, and then we don't reduce the height,
Or you don't increase the height. Yeah.
or don't increase the height.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Can it also be, can the code be amended to be dependent off of setback distance? So that because if somebody already builds a garage that's like 5 feet away from the property line or whatever, we can have a code that if like the setback of the unit is between 5 to 7 feet, height is capped at this, anything greater than 7 feet is capped at that. And so it kind of.
A stepped setback
Like
requirement,
just a
like we've been
trigger,
exploring in the RC zone for hotels, is the further back you get into the property, the higher it can go.
Yep.
I think that notion would be,
And that's 2 sentences instead of a new provision too.
that would solve both issues, where you're allowing the setback opportunity,
Yep.
but if they're desiring more height, then that's the burden, is that
Yeah.
you're not having your cake and eating it too by saying I get a 30 foot
Yeah.
tall on the property. So that would be a more dynamic and variable option that would give more options to property owners versus you have 2 boxes you get into. So,
I still like the idea of just doing the setbacks for now, I think.
okay,
Potentially, unless you really think there's like gonna be a,
we could probably draft something for both and see what is more palatable
totally.
because certainly height is one of the issues.
I just don't wanna throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to council. I'd rather it be
Right,
one small thing instead of something that seems like a little bit more scary. all
right.
at once.
And a variable step back kind of it is quite simple, kind of like you're saying, Lou. And, it can be based off of accessory structures. It can be based off purely of setback. If it's 7, it has to be 20. If it's 12, it can be 30, or whatever variable you like to. But that would seem to make sense for me and be easy enough to explain. I always think about how I'm trying to explain to the public. That seems pretty easy to explain,
Yeah,
regardless of what structure's underneath, whatever it is.
makes sense, geometrically as well, like it feels a lot closer and a lot higher when it's
Yeah.
closer.
Right, right.
That's all the stuff we've done with other code provisions.
Right. We'll go ahead and we'll keep rolling. That's good notes, and I think we'll be able to draft both on that.
Good input, guys, thanks.
Size, the new state law does not allow us to regulate the size of an internal ADU. Do we want to maintain a maximum square footage of external ADUs? Right now, the max is 1,000 square feet. An additional note to that is we don't have a minimum for ADUs right now.
That was my next question.
That hasn't seemed to be an issue. Often, what we end up getting is applications for really, really small ADUs, and then Barry Ellison, our building official, has to go and say, well, the IBC, the International Building Code, doesn't allow you to build that small.
Yeah.
But, so we've seen the minimum size kind of come in at right around 375 to 390 square feet, which is quite small.
Does the IBC still apply, do those standards still apply for an internal ADU
No.
under the new state code?
Well, that's a great point. For minimum, I would think yes. Maximum, no, because minimums is about health and
Yeah, it's
safety.
about toilet distance from the kitchen
Right,
and stuff like
right.
that,
It's,
yeah.
safety regulations than it is anything else, but maximum, no. So 1,000 square feet for external, how do we feel about consistency of not having a max or having 1,000 maintained, building up? The one note I will have on this is kind of the anecdotal experience we've had is we have a lot of people that are coming in with modular plans for ADUs. And it really, they're self-contained units, they're pretty small, they can go in pretty easy, the foundations are pretty manageable. The one thing that you're finding is that there aren't any for under 1,000 square feet. The minimum they're finding, it's like they got 1,050, or 1,200, and it's like, sorry, it doesn't meet our standards. So it seems like there could be a little bit of a increase in that to make more common products work, to make it so that you don't have to stick built necessarily, with modular becoming so popular and so accessible and likely more affordable with our current conditions in the market. So
What do you see as the big reason not to make that change?
the nature of ADUs being accessory, I think in most of the state, they are accessory. They are supplemental to the primary. In Moab, it's often found that we are seeing it as a tool to increase density, which is why we've permitted it kind of in the way we had and have been a little bit more progressive that way than I think the rest of Utah. So it just is changing it from accessory to household, or think about it as dwelling units like the IBC. It doesn't matter what you call it, it's a dwelling unit. So that's the one drawback, which is not a very great one, I'd say.
Yeah, it's tough because you can still only have one, right?
Right, and that's one of that's the very next
I was just gonna
comment.
say, because in my mind this goes, okay, the only reason to not have a bigger one is so you could do two smaller ones instead. And so if we're allowing larger ones to be put there, we don't want to de-incentivize more units.
Sure.
That could go in the same
That's a
space.
great point, considering, what is our desire? Is it to create doors for housing, which I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I would rather
So that's a great point.
see on a lot that could have one 1,100 square foot structure or two, 650 square feet structures, that the latter option be chosen just because it's more.
I think in this community, the one fear you could have is people using an ADU as kind of, and there used to be, people would come in and say, I want two dwellings. You can either do a duplex or an ADU.
Yeah.
And there were advantages or disadvantages. My whole understanding of that has been completely shifted, so I don't know what the disadvantages or advantages are anymore with the new changes. But as far as external goes, this is a really unique opportunity to say, we have the chance to create a bunch more doors, which people, I think, in this community absolutely would do, given the fact, no other than it's going to create more income for them. People are building ADUs to create a source of income for them to help pay off their mortgage for primary. That was one of the driving factors incentivizing ADUs is, have somebody rent out back, helps pay your mortgage, helps them.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
It just expands that, but also creates affordable by design, this component we keep talking about, opportunities by having those two units. And I don't know necessarily, you might have to get creative in crafting that by saying you just increase the square footage of the total ADU square footage. So if it's 12 for a 1,200 square feet for an ADU or ADU space, they can divide that up however they choose. One or two, two potentially being 600 units, or 600 square feet. Don't get that on the record.
I was just gonna say, someone just had a heart attack watching.
600 square feet each, or 500 and 700. How because the site constraints might make it
Totally.
that it can be symmetric for whatever reason.
Yeah, I guess like my one concern with that is Like, if my incentive was to like try to make additional income or whatever, it'd probably be much more profitable for me to break it up into 2 units, where I can charge like $700-800 a month for like a 600 bedroom unit or whatever. And that would potentially only house like 1, maybe 2 people, whereas like a 1,200 square foot ADU has the potential to house like a family.
Sure.
And so, like, are we making sure that we're addressing like the needs of the influx of kind of the tourist-based employees, or kind of some of the year-round employees and families that stay here as well?
Mm-hmm.
And like, is there really any way to promote like a balanced diversity of the types of units that would be built? Because I'm worried that if we do kind of split it up like that, like profit incentive like would drive people towards targeting more of those like individuals rather than families.
Right. Go ahead, John.
I think by nature, the developer will try to figure that out. And so we're trying to create an increased density, and I think we should do whatever we can to allow for that increased density. Supply and demand will help fluctuate the pricing. We just need to get more density to allow for more units, is my view.
Right.
So in a situation like that, maybe the people that are sharing a 3-bedroom home, renting the bedrooms individually, will move to an individual ADU, which will then free up that home
Right.
for a family.
That's
Yeah, which is happening a lot.
it's called that the bunkhouse effect is what we're like, what we're seeing is it isn't, there's 7 people living in a single family household. But a lot of people, police officers, city employees, there's a level of income that you're maybe trying to build your family here, but there isn't that opportunity where that might open up that opportunity where if you're on that seasonal guide employee level, those multiple units would be really great versus being in a bunk situation or a group home type situation,
Yeah.
shared housing, that you have your own space and can develop a little bit more of a rooted system here in Moab. But then, like John's saying, it offers the opportunity that those people could branch out and then open up that home for the folks that might be able to move into a single family household with the family unit.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's like a very like real possibility, but a lot of times people are also bunking up in those houses because of the very high monthly rental costs that would potentially be cost prohibitive to some of these families that, like, yes, now there's a space open, but like we still can't afford it.
Sure.
'Cause, yeah, at Sea Haven, like our biggest like issue is finding housing for our clients, period, but in particular for families. Like, we can find a room here or there to like send one of our single clients into, but to be able to actually find a place for a family to move into is one of the kind of biggest prohibitive like issues that we run into on a very continuous basis. And like not having that access kind of guaranteed, I think has a possibility to permeate more negative effects like throughout the community, where these people are very frequently forced to re-enter like dangerous situations, and like taxes are like law enforcement officers, like potentially emergency room visits and all that stuff, let alone any sort of like long-term effects that are associated with like continued exposure to those types of situations. And so yeah, it's one of those things. I absolutely believe that we need to increase density in one form or another, but like, is it potentially going to be done in a way that comes at the expense of a particular group of people that then is going to have other like collateral damage or ramifications to the community because they weren't able to access these types of like resources?
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think
Go ahead, Corey. I was just gonna say, I think the point that we're at right now, just with inventory, period, any more inventory is gonna help the system at all. Just looking at, we're talking about the size and no more than one ADU per lot. I think both of those things are due for a change, just to what degree is really what we have to figure out. my house is a small manufactured house. It's 1,100 square feet, and you could not put my house on someone as an ADU, and I'm on like 0.02 of an acre is my entire lot, just because I'm in an HOA. But, and it's small, like that, but my house could very comfortably house a family with multiple kids, you know, so something, even kicking that square foot max up a little bit would be, I think, super helpful. And maybe it's just a flat square footage for one single family lot, or whatever the lot size is, you get X amount of square feet for ADUs, and how you build that
Could be
is,
a component of it.
yeah.
Because then you wouldn't do necessarily a number cap. Well,
Yeah.
you may do a number cap, but it'd be more about how much
Yeah.
floor area is being provided.
Yeah, if you want to put 2 tiny homes or one, 1,100 square foot manufactured house, that's up to you.
To just circle back before we get too far off with Lou's comment, and then kind of stemming off what John said, as far as the market handling some of these components and developers are gonna build what the market requires. That's the nature of it for the most part. But the group that may be being overlooked in this scenario, I guess the question to you is, do we want ADUs to be that resolution or solution versus another form of something, discussion about housing that we could approach?
So my view is that, the ADU concept is going to get and attract
Right.
the homeowner who wants to have, additional revenue streams, or the relatively small developer that might develop as a side gig to their day job. It's not going to attract someone that's going to build 40, 50, 70 unit apartment complexes. So the ADU thing is like, we should fix it. We should allow for more density and make it easier. We need to fix the multifamily zone and allow for increased density.
We need to fix
in my
all
mind.
the zones. to
Yes,
allow
we do.
for
Yeah,
increased
we
Yeah,
density.
try- I
But
guess-
this is a good bridge to that, though.
Yeah, right. I guess to more concisely make my comment is, do ADUs need to be that tool to fix that problem? Because I think with ADUs, what we are addressing is doors and small square footage density.
True,
It's a
yeah.
great tool for that, but maybe we look to another tool to really address that family group size, which is in maybe that multifamily
I
housing.
think it's gonna be little bits
solution.
here and little bits there, and this
Sure,
seems like
but like you're
something-
saying, 1,100,
Yeah.
1,200 square foot
Honestly, I
could
think this
house a
seems,
family.
I'm trying to think like a current city council member, this seems far more palatable than a lot of those other changes at this point. It seems doable, and it seems a little bit more controlled, because you do have it, it's not like you're selling your ADUs, right? You know,
Right, that's a portion that is actually the very next one.
Yeah.
You're right on top of it.
it's, you're still the property owner
Right.
there on the property, you're having some sort of control, that's not just like,
Right.
okay, you're off on your own,
Right.
no.
Right,
Which inherently restricts what's gonna happen there, I think.
right.
And I agree. I think there's probably a better tailored tool to specifically address that, but I can also see like in the interim, like ADUs, like from my perspective, especially from like my Sea Haven perspective, make like really excellent transitional housing, or can give somebody the ability to kind of like start developing some sort of stability in their lives while they look for those next opportunities, which can ideally be addressed with that next tool. And yeah, I do like the idea of increasing like the maximum square footage, but potentially having like a minimum like set in. And so like that way, if like, let's say we move the maximum to like 1,500 square feet or whatever, that way that gives like the homeowners some flexibility in what they want to put. They can put like 1,500 square foot, or like, let's say we have a minimum of 500, then they can have like 3 500 square foot like units, or 1 500 and one like 1,000 square foot unit, which can like add to the diversity of like the different housing that can potentially be developed, or housing opportunities that can be developed.
What would be the setback between each ADU?
Yeah, and maybe
Typically, what we would find there, which is on any parcel, like you would have multi-household, it'd be based on fire standards. So 10 feet without increased fire suppression, which can come in the form of firewalls or sprinklers. On the residential level, sprinklers are not optimal for homeowners. Firewalls are more achievable, but the best option is to keep them 10 feet apart. Which would be a limiting factor if you're saying it's multiple units. Well, you're gonna have to have a pretty big backyard to fit all those.
Some people with really big backyards.
But they're there, they're out there,
town.
they're out there, right? So
Huge
it's,
lots.
So would
Huge
that,
lots.
would it be better to, instead of saying a set 1,500 square feet or whatever the number is, a percentage of the land?
that gets really messy. We have some components of that in our code and it does not work well for architects or us. So it's a good thought.
Though.
But as
Yeah.
me as the planner, when I'm reviewing those and have to do those percentages of lots that are 70% open space in here, and that is really
I wasn't
challenging.
thinking open space, I was just thinking if the lot is an acre,
Right.
and we just said 10%, they could do 4,300 whatever, 65 square feet of.
It's possible. I mean, we could do it that way. That was an example of the open space one that we do
If
have.
it gets messy for you guys, then it's not worth it.
Right. Where if it's messy for us, who we deal with the code, trying to tell, the clarity of ADUs, how can we make ADUs more approachable?
Yes.
That would likely not be a scenario that would do that.
I would say that that's only because we went through all of this discussion when we were putting the pad together. Minimums kind of handle themselves if the.
I agree.
if
Putting a
those
minimum in the
requirements,
ADU would make
yeah.
it less flexible. And so if our goal is to be more flexible,
Yeah.
I wouldn't put that in. But increasing the maximum, you don't lose anything by saying,
Yeah.
well, the kind of minimum ends up being this, which is about 400.
Yeah.
So that concept
Can we
of
set the
3
minimum
units.
at that like IBC kind of like standard, just so that you don't continue to get these like applicants coming in?
what we don't want to do is maybe shut the door to possibilities, configurations
Yeah.
that we haven't seen, because that's the configurations we have seen end up being right around there. But again,
There's some squirrely Dr. Seussy kind of things that people can come up with. that
right,
work.
we're not, it'd be more language. What I don't want to do is add more language to the code that's superfluous.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I like the idea of increasing the maximum and allowing more than one ADU per lot. It just still has to fit within whatever that maximum is, whatever.
What do you guys think ballpark for something like that?
Oh, gosh, this is 100% one of those. I would really like to get the temperature of city council before we work a whole bunch on figuring out what those numbers are. Because if they're gonna hear 1,500 and that's gonna be an immediate no, then I don't wanna waste our time with that. But,
I think
you know,
what might be
something's-
helpful,
I like fives. It makes
sure,
you.
division's easier.
With
and-
setbacks, you couldn't have 3 units that were 500 square feet if it was 1,500, but.
Right.
Maybe you could if they were 2 stories, but that might
Right.
just make sense as an easy sort of division.
Sure. I think that would fall in line with what we've seen, and what I might be able to provide and find is data on what a pretty average or common modular home
Yeah.
is. So when people are coming in, they're saying, oh, it's just over 1,000. Well, what is that just over 1,000, so that we're maybe just beyond that barrier threshold, that
Yeah.
all of a sudden we have these very accessible modular units that are now an option, or you can stick build in a way that is
Yeah.
multi-door oriented.
Yeah. Mine is a very common modular and it's 1,100.
Yeah, and that's what we have seen a lot of, is 11 or 12.
Yeah.
15, there are some out there, but they're not the minimums.
Yeah.
So when people are searching for minimums, they come up with 11 or 12. Okay.
We should ask Dan Mick. He's got it down.
Yeah, I bet he does. Deed restrictions, the current restrictions prohibits the use of an ADU as a nightly rental. That provision should be maintained. Do we want to add an owner occupation requirement and/or no subdivision of land for an ADU? So a quick note on this, our current ADU code, which was in the packet, there is a provision on there that is a requirement standard that you're not allowed to subdivide the land of the ADU. but it's not a part of the deed restriction. So for clarification, that would be added from just the criteria to the deed restriction component, and then using that owner-occupied requirement, which is a part of the new House bill. Okay, you got it, John, no problem. So right now, we've got the nightly rental in there. Do we want to add the owner-occupied requirement like is consistent with the internal ADU, and then also move over that subdivision of land criteria to the deed restriction, which would be, right now it's common code, but it wouldn't be a bad thing to have that all encapsulated into that deed. So owner occupation is really kind of the big question here, I think.
How would that even work with an ADU? How do you have owner-occupied ADU? Oh, no, the primary dwelling would have.
Primary, or, I mean, I believe in the internal, it's not as specific where the owner must occupy one of the two dwellings.
Yeah.
Not so specific, the primary, because that's when you start exchanging of, well, I'm just gonna call this an ADU and I'm gonna call that my primary, especially if there's no square footage requirements. External gets a little more complicated to just switch the names because there is that max.
No, I don't think that makes sense for external ADUs.
But yeah, having the owner occupation to it speaks more to having this be along the mother-in-law original concept of, I live here and I'm gonna supplement my home with this unit, versus if you don't include that in external is what you see as a developer coming and doing a housing development and adding an ADU as just purely a density bump variable. Not a bad thing when we are in need of housing stock, but it's the nature of what the ADU is. So it's going back to what you guys want to see these ADUs
Currently
produce.
do not have an owner occupation requirement for ADUs.
Not in external, there will be one in the internal.
But in our code that provides, right,
No,
I don't
there's
see
not.
a reason to add it.
Okay,
I
so
think
just
it's-
go in internal. And then-
Internal makes sense because you're, especially with what you're saying that
Yeah.
like, you know, you don't even have to have a control for the heat in the ADU when it's internal and there's no square footage requirement. And it's very much like they're just, you know, you have some rooms downstairs in your house with like a hot plate and a mini fridge. Like that's an ADU now. With the new state code, that makes sense that there's some requirement of a little bit more oversight almost on that from the actual property owner. But for external, it hasn't been that way for us before. I don't necessarily see, and y'all feel free to chime in, a reason to add that.
I am generally not an advocate of the owner-occupied requirement. I think it does a disservice, so I don't think we should add it in.
Yeah, I mean, particularly if they're already barred from doing any sort of nightly rentals and it's like a minimum of 30 days, like it should still be addressing like the housing needs within the community by like having more structures built.
The only, I think one of the reasons, again, I wish Nora were here to explain, because some of these are her concepts, where this was coming from a realm of reducing potentials for second homes. Removing owner occupation requirement from external ADUs, and why it's just another unit, kind of viewing it that way, is what we're starting to see mostly in the R3 is second home constructions in the form of townhomes.
Yes.
So you're shutting one door, but you're also opening another by saying, we're not gonna have it, we're not gonna have that owner requirement, but then you're opening up the door opportunity for, say, people to come and buy as a second home, have that be a vacant home for most of the year, except for when they let their friends come stay or themselves.
But how often, so I'm thinking about someone who, me personally, I'm in a position where I could go have a second home somewhere else. I wouldn't necessarily want to have a second home and then have to manage a couple of ADUs behind it. Like I wouldn't want the headache. If I can afford a second home, does that person actually want the headache having to manage the tenants behind there also? Maybe that happens
Because it's
a
still
lot, but-
tenancy, right? It's not like someone owns the ADU and someone owns the
Correct.
primary
It's a tenancy,
structure.
right?
It's
We're
a
talking about
tenancy,
we're talking about the primary here.
Yeah. There's not a situation where there's an owner of an ADU that's different from the owner of the.
Right, and that's that subdivision component of it.
Yeah.
The point being, if it's owner occupied, likely, because of exactly what you're saying, you're not gonna want to have an empty house. But right now, that is an option for people, which it's coming up because it has come up. It's not super common, but it is common enough that people they'll buy their second home and then put an ADU on the land, or there is an ADU, they buy the whole set already, and they use that ADU to supplement the tax so that it's basically just an empty house, except for when they come down.
Yeah, and is there anything?
It's not, yeah, it hasn't never happened.
Yeah.
It's happening rarely, but it is happening.
In those situations, is there anything that bars them from just like hiring out a property management company to deal with anything that happens while they're away?
No, you're giving away secrets, Luke. I don't know why you're,
No, they can do that. You can do that.
no, you can do that certainly.
And so like it wouldn't be that much of a hassle.
I think it's just more they wouldn't want people living on their property, essentially. That's kind of what John's saying. Not less the
It's
hassle
more of a
and more
liability
like.
thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's places like that. I have friends that essentially work for people who don't live here. They are on the ADU on their property of their
Yep.
nice house that they built, and they manage the property and like
Yep.
plan all their activities when they're here. But also that's their full-time job, and they're provided housing in the course of it as locals, so. Yeah, I mean, I would love it if someone who came and bought a second home put a little ADU on it and let somebody live in it long-term. I think that's better than just the first option, so.
Sure.
I mean, I don't
Right,
know.
I mean, that's really the question, is does
Yeah.
it make you itchy? And the answer is
Yeah.
kind of no, it's
Yeah.
not for us.
I recognize the risk in 5 years as influx to small communities increases, we may kick ourselves for allowing it, but I just think it's a matter, we just need doors.
Yeah.
And we need them in the city.
Yeah.
This is one way to help that happen.
I would love to see every house deed restricted to local ownership in town, but that isn't feasible, so. Or local occupancy, I should say.
Let me,
Was there another thing on
Okay.
the bottom, or?
I think
Yeah.
it's a duplicate of the setbacks.
Yeah.
And that concludes that, but there were two additional questions that Nora and I talked about that aren't on here, and it just kind of got brought up ourselves. Is right now, I don't know, in fact, we don't have any code prohibiting ADUs from being developed on twin home lots. And the question becomes, do we allow ADUs on townhome lots? Which is a platted lot, not an independent parcel. But now that we've come to this opening up more than one, it could potentially come up and occur. We haven't seen the townhome question come up, so I don't know thoroughly what the current code response would be. But we have seen the twin home come up, and we've permitted it because it's its own parcel lot and it has sufficient square footage and sufficient area. Then why not for external? Internals would have been not permitted. So this is one of those unique circumstances where if it's a twin home, it's a shared wall structure.
Yep.
There's a phraseology in the law, and I can't verbatim remember it, but it's essentially saying a connected dwelling. An internal ADU is not permitted in a connected dwelling. But we didn't quite understand what that was until this whole it means it's a
Yeah.
townhome or a twin home. But that brought up the question, well, what about external for us?
Yeah.
So external, we have permitted a twin. Not sure about townhome. What do you guys think about variable types of lots? Or
Gosh, how many places does that apply to? Because if
As
you
we're
already
seeing
have
more and
townhomes,
more-
you're already going as dense as you kind of can, it seems
but
like.
without ADUs, ADUs don't
They don't count against.
require density, right?
Yeah.
irrelevant to density, so it'd be essentially, you do as many units as you can, plus your ADUs. And no doubt, once that concept maybe takes root, it likely will happen. So thinking about some of the ADUs that were just constructed, in theory, you could have put one on there potentially previously. Not sure now how we're moving forward, but
I'm all for it.
fair enough.
That's my thought.
I'm still trying to envision it.
It's with the townhomes, a twin home seems to make sense externally. A townhome where it's a series of at least 3 or more
Yeah.
connected homes.
Like row houses, basically. Like,
Row houses that
yeah.
you, all of a sudden, you're now producing another dwelling somewhere in the lot. It really shakes up the orientation, because typically there's gonna be a yard side and a access side, driveway and garage to some degree.
I know, I keep
So on
thinking
that
about
yard
Ben
side,
Bird's place over.
you know,
by the
picturing an
Walmart.
ADU sitting out in the front there.
Architecturally, it might look funny.
And going back to your developers and
It already
and
looks
the
funnier.
market dictating, it may not be, it may not meet an appetite of a type of
Yeah, I
developer. Because if
don't
they're
know.
going for twin home, they're going for clientele that's typically not eclectic in a way that ADUs are.
I don't know a situation where it would happen,
Right.
but I'm for allowing it.
Future
Okay.
developments, for sure, you could see that kind of being worked into.
Sure, right.
Yeah, I don't know. That's one where it's like, man, I'd sure just rather mess with the density requirements to allow them to get another townhome unit on there instead of having to do the ADU.
It doesn't seem to match.
Yeah.
With the twin home, it seems to, oh, that makes sense. Twin homes, it doesn't seem to jive. But what we end up getting is when we get these, whether it's philosophical or it's an actual application, it's like,
Yeah.
hey, we haven't heard of that before. We have to dig into the code and find legal findings to support whatever our decision is one way or another, with some flexibility of interpretation from the code. We like to limit that as much as possible, because when it comes down to interpretation, that's where variable of contest may come in. So, something to think about maybe.
Yeah.
I don't think we're gonna
I'm
finalize
curious,
this.
I'd be curious to see just a mock-up of like what that would
I
look
can
like.
hardly
And I
picture it
need
myself, yeah.
I mean, you know me long enough now to know that I like to think of like, okay, what's the worst case scenario, and like, let's
Right,
plan for that and make sure our code accounts for it if that's something we don't
Right.
actually want to happen.
So if, like, we were to allow townhomes to potentially add ADUs to, like, the lot or whatever, would, like, any one of the owners of, like, one of the townhomes be able
How
to,
does
like,
that work?
yeah, like,
that's the question, right? That's the question. I'm pulling up our city map right now.
Stupid question, like with a townhome, ownership is individual, but the lot is not subdivided.
Nora went over this with the council,
Yeah,
and it is
sorry,
somewhat
refresh me.
complex. No, that's all right. Essentially, there are 2 forms of owner occupation of a lot that are acknowledged by the state. That is a subdivision and a condominium.
Yes.
A townhome is kind of a weird blend of both, where a condominium, by nature, is only paint to paint. It's a larger principal owner or collection of ownership, CC&R or whatever, and you own your little unit. Townhomes are, the difference is that they're associated with land, either immediately below whatever your particular structure is. So like a row house would have your side and then the land immediately under it. Or a type of division like we saw with the bird, which is long strips where your row house fits within that, but there's also particular yard and particular rear yard or access associated just with your property. There's issues with both of those. I'll share a screen. This is one of the properties in the city. These were condominium units, and then they were converted to townhomes for financing purposes. Bank lenders prefer townhomes because there's tangible land associated with it. So we're seeing them become more and more common.
Yeah.
Like Nora said, there is a condominium plat or there's a subdivision. they are kind of a little bit of both. So when we see a townhome plat, it goes to planning commission and then city council because it's a subdivision of land. A condominium plat, planning commission will be the only one that approves it because it is in that purview. My point here is, if this is a townhome plat, these individual units are individually owned, and then the larger ownership organization, however they have that structured, in theory, you'd be able to, you said how to visualize it, you put a little cabin over in this
Yeah.
corner somewhere.
Yeah.
So this is a scenario where that might have been applicable.
But who owns that cabin?
Well, that would be the question.
Yeah.
Well, under this situation, isn't it that cabin is on land that would be owned by the association?
It would be,
common area?
in theory, yes.
So it would have to, in my mind, this situation does not apply to that because it's common ownership of land.
Sure.
So you'd have to have the association on board with that. Now, in a row home type, long, narrow lots where you have more fee ownership than just your stick-built structure.
Right. This is another townhome plat situation. This is not one of those that we recommend. It creates a lot of issues orienting them in this way, where this is actually a separate common parcel. This is a lot 1, lot 2, lot 3. In theory, so kind of shaking it up, okay, the other one didn't apply, that seems to make sense. So this is privately owned, like you're saying, row house, but it is slightly oriented different than a row home, which would be hard to visualize. Could this person do a ADU here?
In my mind, yes. Now, they obviously have to work out the access issues through the common ownership of land.
And parking would be the second component on that, but I think I'm following what you're saying, and it seems to make sense. Where
If they had the parking requirement and figured out how access into that?
so the short answer is yes, if they can meet the surrounding standards. Is kind of what it sounds
Yeah,
like.
and
John's kinda
that's pretty,
his
the
knee
surrounding
jerk.
standards are pretty constrained when you're already working with far less on a parcel
Sure.
because it's a townhome in the
Right.
first place.
Right.
So I don't have a temporal issue
Okay.
with that.
This and
Just because
if we
there's
don't
tons
write
of
this into the
fail-safes,
code,
yeah.
we don't acknowledge this at all.
Yeah,
This helps at least us in the planning office when we start
yeah.
trying to dissect some of these questions. This conversation has helped,
The
I
rare
think,
instance
already.
that someone owns a townhome and they want to create more housing
Yeah.
on their lot. Go for it.
Gotcha. That was the end of the suggestions that Nora had provided and wanted us to chat about, and really brings us kind of the end of our non-meeting agenda. Thank you guys for being here.
That's super interesting. It's cool to see that this is some really tangible, feasible stuff
Yeah.
that can happen quite quickly, hopefully, so.
It's, this opportunity where we're being directed to change our code is kind of, when you open up the hood, you might as well tinker around a few of the
Yeah.
bad spots
Happy it's
anyway.
something
so-
good for once that we're being directed to.
Right, right. So that concludes my end of the discussion. Are there any other comments or scenarios, questions you guys might have on that?
No, I think it's super informative. I think it makes a lot of sense. Particularly with the prices of lumber starting to go back down again, there might be some people who are rethinking like, oh, maybe I could do this after all, who, because they couldn't make it work or because it was cost prohibitive, maybe this is what they do with their little investment money now instead, so. I think
Perfect.
it makes sense, and I think it's excellent as a stopgap in between larger density and zone changes, so.
Yeah, no, I'm all for trying to simplify things and make it easier. I think a lot of the community has definitely built up a lot of equity in their properties right now that they could potentially use to help kind of facilitate building out something like this. Would be able to help them supplement the cost of their homes while helping alleviate a lot of the issues and,
Like it. Okay, well then I informally close this informal
Okay,
workshop.
future agenda items if you want them, but
Yes.
there aren't many. I was always gonna say is referencing back to our public hearing on that into our code. Fairly straightforward. It's really a matter of it's a use we have, but it's not explicitly outlined. But getting that, it's been a long day. That into our code appropriately. But also one component of that was going to be a discussion, so maybe you can start thinking about for next time, is the potential of including brew pubs specifically to that one use in the C5. The way that the breakdown is there were different types of uses in the different zones where they're appropriate. We didn't include the C5 because of the nature of that, but that was something that was going to be up to you guys as a discussion point based on the nature of that zone. We will likely be seeing, we've pushed it off now a couple times and you've heard it, the Creekside Townhomes site plan would be coming to you guys as a level 2 site plan. This was one that was approved on Cane Creek, right at the junction of Main Street there, and then was the rezone for
By the Burger King, old Burger King?
Yes.
Okay, yep.
The applicants are needing to get in a few more materials, so we've been waiting on them, so we were kind of posed to put on your agenda, but Nora was reaching out. Hopefully you see them this next time, hopefully.
Okay.
The hospital, Moab Regional Hospital expansion is coming through as a site plan, a major amendment to the approved site plan from the original plan. So it does come back to you guys as the land use authority. It's going to include some dynamic parcel arrangements, organization between the parcels that they have and they're utilizing as their larger campus with a new clinic they're going to be putting off of the main hospital campus, but then also an expansion on the hospital itself. So that's something they're urgently trying to press forward. So we're trying to work with them the best we can to get the plans up to snuff for you guys, but they're trying to make it onto the 22nd commission meeting. I don't know if it'll be intact by that point, but those are the two pending ones that we have for next time.
And we will have a new commissioner by the next meeting, right?
We will. She'll be confirmed this next city council meeting Tuesday.
Huzzah.
Britton. She's a legacy planning
I
commissioner.
know, like, is that our first legacy planning commissioner? It might be. I love it. I love that. Well, it's probably not me, but I think someone younger than Ruben.
All right, I think that does it for us.
All right, thank you, Corey.
Thanks, everyone.
And hey, congrats on the new family member, man.
Hey, thanks. Part of the long days.
Yeah.
New baby. Little boy's just under 3 months right now.